Hello, thank you for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. I am David Pendergrass. If you haven't already, check out davidpendergrass.com. And if you're listening to this podcast, there are many more like these that you can listen to whenever you want to for free. For free. I love that word, free, especially for good things. And I hope this podcast is a good thing. Check out davidpendergrass.com or utilize whatever podcast software you prefer and search for the word A Glimpse of the Kingdom, and you'll find me here. I really appreciate the work of Christian philosophers. There are a lot of popular level Christian philosophers, and some that are not popular level, people like Alvin Plantinga and others. Philosophy is not my field. I had some philosophy, but in general it's not my specialty, even though I have a doctorate in philosophy, a doctorate of philosophy, but it is in a different field, under the broad category of philosophy. I appreciate them. People like William Lane Craig, J.P. Moreland, many others. Something that comes up often in discussions I have with people when I am discussing their particular works when it comes to the Bible is that I find myself disagreeing with them quite a bit. And that's surprising to me because I agree on a whole lot of things with people like a Bill Craig and J.P. Moreland and others, but I'll stick with Bill Craig for a second. He's one I really respect, and I don't disagree with a lot of what he says hardly ever. I find myself agreeing a whole lot with him over and over and over. And of course, other times I'm just learning from him. But on information about which I already have knowledge, I find myself concurring with him very, very often. For example, we're both not Calvinists. We both believe that Calvinism is a false understanding of the biblical picture of God. And while we both might be wrong, we both have the same view on this issue for similar reasons. We have similar views about a lot of things. But what's interesting is when a person like myself, who is trained in biblical studies and ancient contexts and theology, when I listen to something as opposed to what a philosopher does, it's very different. And there might not be a massive therefore, but maybe one type of encouragement or challenge at the very end of this. But if you listen to my podcast often, then you'll care about this, I think, to a degree. When I come to the biblical text, I come at it very differently than a person who's been trained in philosophy and in systematic theology. Now, a couple just reflections on this, just, in a short podcast, but one is to say, just to make sure you understand, most people do not understand this because it's not their field, and that's okay. It's okay. Just like if someone says someone's a doctor, well, they could be a cardiologist, anesthesiologist, there's all kinds of subspecialties, subgroups. So when you say someone is doctor or someone who studied medicine, that's a broad category. If you're talking to a specialist, you're going to say, well, technically, no, I'm not this, I'm a this. Well, that's how, in almost, I'm sure, any field. What is sure is that way when it comes to anything involving the study of Christianity. When someone studies the doctrine of God in a way that focuses upon patterns of belief, typically we call these people systematic theologians. They're looking for systems. So when you ask the question of a person, let's say a Christian thinker, what is the Christian view on angels? A systematic theologian will go through basically every Bible verse there is, and maybe and also what the early church believed in the late antiquity, the early church fathers believed, and so forth, and come to a conclusion. They're giving you a broad, systematic answer. And that's what systematic theologians do. Biblical theologians are different. Biblical theologians look at what biblical authors say individually. And so they are atomistic. Atomistic means they look at one slice at a time, whereas systematic theologian is looking at the pie, the whole thing. Biblical theologians typically focus on the slices of the pie without a concern to make sure it fits the whole. And that's just in theology. Theology, you don't even have to study the Bible. You have people sometimes called constructivist theologians, and they are people who talk about all kinds of things that maybe say, what does the Trinity mean? Well, they keep reflecting. They may never ask the question, what did Trinity, or what are the roots of Trinitarian theology in the Bible? They might be reflecting today on the significance of how to understand the Trinity. And there are people who specialize just in that. What does the resurrection mean? What's some Christian reflection on the resurrection? And they may never even mention the Bible. You have Christian ethicists, people who focused on, of course, ethics. Inside of that discipline, you have subdisciplines like bioethics. What are the ethical implications of embryonic research and abortion and so forth? You have ethicists that deal with war, people who specialize in particular categories. Then you have a very different kind of breed of person called, you might say, a biblicist. A biblicist is a person who studies biblical texts, and they focus almost always, they usually pick one of the major testaments, Old Testament or New Testament. So we would call them, you don't call an Old Testament theologian, and this is very, I guess, a little footnote, it's always said incorrectly when you listen to a non-specialist. Specialists, I guess, can get a chuckle out of it, or sometimes frustration, but Old Testament theologian is a person who focuses on the theology of God in the Old Testament. An Old Testament biblicist is a person who studies the biblical text. Typically they're focusing on what was the meaning of a text within its ancient historical literary context. Therefore, most biblicists are tied to a particular way of reading the Bible called the historical critical method. Sometimes it's called other things, but that's the major way, and that is the dominant way a person who becomes a biblicist studies the Bible. And so there's a degree to which a biblicist is an historian. That is to say, they are attempting to reconstruct what the ancient author was thinking when he wrote those words. And the subdiscipline of that is someone who asks the question, well, what was the audience thinking when they heard those words? And that's also a different, so underneath biblicist, you have all kinds of subspecialties. People who focus on reader response criticism, and anyway, I go on for a long time. There's a subdiscipline, and go on and on. Now, on top of that, you have Old Testament, New Testament scholars. Let's say, I'll just say New Testament for a second. You have people in New Testament who focus just on one side. Say they're a Pauline or Pauline specialist, people who just focus on the letters of Paul. You might have people who focus on the Gospels, particularly one Gospel, a Markan specialist. Now, in the American school system, they focus a lot of energy on being a generalist. So the American master's and certainly the PhD system, you are forced to take a bunch of classes, you might call them core classes, before you specialize. And in American's liberal arts education, undergraduate, master's, and PhD are all similar in that regard. In the British school system, European schools, and basically European in general, that is not the case. They specialize early on, and they can get, it's kind of the old adage that they might get an inch wide but a mile deep. Americans can be a mile wide and an inch deep. That's not true for everybody at all time, but that's kind of how it works. The American school system is different, and that's why a lot of times people who get an American education, it's easier to get a job at an American university because they have the training, where it's a little more difficult to cross over an American education and get a university posting in European, because they will assume you didn't have as much specialty in one area. And that's not always the case, but that's a common belief. And you have subspecialties amongst those things. So let's say you're a Pauline specialist and someone spends all their energy focusing on Paul's understanding of justification. So you can see it just gets, every little issue, there's a massive category. But in general, a biblicist or a New Testament scholar, Old Testament scholar, if you mean one on the street, or if you go to the professorship, almost always they're going to be focusing on how an ancient text should have been understood and intended to be understood in the context in which it was composed. There's a whole different kind of category of specialist, someone who focuses on the texts, the manuscript of the biblical text, and these are called textual critics. Textual critic might not know much at all about God, and they can study the snot out of the manuscripts. How were the manuscripts composed? How were they copied? What are they comprised of? Are they papyrus? Are they vellum? Are they on stone? I mean, where are they at, and where are they located now, and which one gets us closer to the original? That's a particular science and a little bit of an art to it, but a lot of scientific criteria, controls, you might say. And that is where you get your Bible translation that you read. It's probably in English. I'm assuming if you're listening to this, maybe not. I have listeners around the world, but wherever your translation comes from, if it's not coming from the Greek or Hebrew, that means a committee, whether it's Spanish or whatever, they went back, ideally, to the original manuscripts, that is, the manuscripts that we actually have in libraries and so forth. Not the originals that Paul wrote. We don't have those anymore. But the original, the oldest, let's say it that way, the original languages, that's what I'm trying to say. Whew. So that's what happens. So your Bible, if it is not in Greek or Hebrew, with a little bit of Latin, a little bit of Aramaic, but if it's not in those things, it means you're reading a translation. So you're already one language removed, but you're only one language removed. Little footnote, it's a very common charge amongst atheists and skeptics that I can't trust the Bible because it's 12 languages removed from the original. That's just absolute nonsense. It's just nonsense. The Bible is not, that you read today, I don't care what translation it is, today, you are not reading something that's 8, 9, 10, 12, 15, 20 languages removed. That's nonsense. You're one language removed, just one. Because of scholars. Scholars spend their entire adult career specializing in ancient languages. And you get the requisite ancient language and then you translate it. And that's it. So people are still finding manuscripts. We are still learning here and there a little more about the languages as we discover. And there are literally over 1 million ancient, especially the ancient world, Mesopotamian fragments. There's all kinds of stuff that's never been translated. Some things we cannot translate yet. Some ancient forms of ancient Greek that antedate, way antedate the New Testament. All I'm saying is there are ancient manuscripts of all kinds of cultures that haven't been translated. Some that can be translated just haven't yet, because it takes a lot of man and woman hours to do it, and you have to have the specialist, and they usually have to get paid. And so a lot we don't know yet. Okay, well, I say that to say there's a lot of subdisciplines. So when a person studies systematic theology, I'm going to go back to that for a second because I'm talking a little bit about William Lane Craig, who I really respect. Bill Craig has 2 earned PhDs. One, of course, is in philosophy, and that's his real bread and butter. His second earned doctorate in Germany was in systematic theology. So he specialized in bringing together a bunch of different texts and some of the early church as well, and giving us a systematic approach to something. Now, that's a common field. I took systematic theology for a couple years in my master's degree, and it's just a common thing. If you go get your master's of divinity, you will at some point probably take a systematic theology class. It's a common deal. Well, my point there is, what it means though is, if you were trained in that, you're not trained as a biblicist, and they're different. And there's two things in particular that I think up often. Recently, I was listening to Bill Craig on, well, it doesn't matter now. I listen to a lot of things. But the point is, there are 2 particular authors I've heard him quote, and both the times when I hear him quoted, I find myself very frustrated. I go, no, that's not what he meant. That's not, or he's not being represented. Craig is a stinking genius. And he's a good guy. I have no doubt about him or his capacities or his motivation. He's a brilliant guy. And when I disagree, doesn't mean I'm right, because maybe he's right. But I think I'm right. So, for example, 2 big names. One really big name in Old Testament studies, particularly, he's an evangelical guy, so he's particularly big amongst the evangelicals. His name is John Walton. Walton is probably my favorite Old Testament scholar out there, and I've learned from a lot of Old Testament scholars, but he's one of them. And he's great. And when William Lane Craig, talks about creation and Genesis and so forth, he used John Walton's argument for creation as one of the many options there is out there. And he didn't like it. He didn't like it for several reasons. But one of the reasons he didn't like it is because it had philosophical deficiencies. And I found myself frustrated on that on multiple levels. But the main one is this. Of course, my training is different. I was trained as a biblicist, as a biblical historian, and also with the narrative criticism as well. So I found myself going, no. Craig, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you like the philosophy of his view. It doesn't matter if you can pull all the threads together and make a cogent philosophical argument for creation according to Genesis. That is not at all what John Walton is attempting to do. John Walton is a biblicist. As an Old Testament specialist, what John Walton is attempting to do is to adequately represent what the authors of Genesis were attempting to communicate within the context in which they wrote it. Which means you got to time travel at least 2,500 years ago and read ancient forms of Hebrew and then analyze all that, and then read as much as you can of every single other ancient literature out in the world in that time period. Mesopotamian, Canaanite, Egyptian, all of it. Now, Craig has read a lot of that, a good bit, which is great, but Walton's attempt is not to give a systematic approach to understanding creation. It's just not. It's not a quote-unquote biblical view. That's not what he's trying to do either. He was in his works, The Lost World of Genesis 1, which you need to read if you haven't, all the Lost World series by John Walton. You don't have to agree with everything he says. They're just really well done. But that's my point here, is that's one major distinction, is that if you listen to my podcast, if you listen to my teachings ever, you'll notice that what I don't do is attempt to make sure that the ancient biblical author presents a picture of something that I find personally philosophically satisfying. That's not what I do, and I don't care about that. Personally, I just don't care because I don't think we should do that. Secondly, I don't care because I was never trained to do that. You just drilled in your head as a biblicist. You do not do that. It doesn't matter if you think it's philosophically, ethically, theologically satisfying. The goal, first and foremost, has to be, what did this ancient author mean by these ancient words? And the best way you can decide what those words meant and how to understand it is by examining it closely in its original languages and studying, comparing, and contrasting whatever every other ancient culture said when they used those words and or those concepts. Another thing that happens is very similar. He's an Old Testament guy. A New Testament guy who's both a New Testament historian and a theologian. That's N.T. Wright, or Tom. Big T, Big Tommy. Tom Wright is a massive voice in New Testament studies. He's not the only. And people always say, so-and-so is the premier, the top scholar. You need to know that's a laughing joke. In scholarship, you never say so-and-so is the leading scholar. It doesn't work that way. It just doesn't. You can have your MVPs, but they're not scoring things or shooting hoops. It doesn't work. But generally, people who make the top 20, top 30 list of scholars are people that other scholars quote from all the time. And Tom Wright is one of the people that most people communicate with, not all the time, but in the literature, they'll have something to say with Tom. And it just depends on the stuff. But anyway, it depends on the literature. But that's another place where Craig doesn't like Tom Wright's view. And another thing, and I've heard this, where Walton is about Genesis, Tom Wright's and Craig's issue has to do with atonement and Jesus' return. And very recently I was listening to a podcast where Tom Wright was asked on the Unbelievable podcast of whether or not someone asked Tom Wright to respond to Craig's view, Craig's critique of Tom. Do you get into that at all? Do you make sense? Someone critiqued N.T. Wright, and they wrote into the show Unbelievable and said, hey, ask Tom Wright about it. What's his response to Craig and his critique? Tom Wright's view, I fully grasped. And then Craig responded to in his podcast to Tom Wright's response. And he kind of understood him, but not really. Bill Craig kept saying, well, that's implausible, not explaining why it is implausible. What Tom Wright is trying to do is just like John Walton, the biblicist, is trying to understand what, for example, in this particular example, what did Jesus mean when he used the Son of Man vocabulary at the trial, of Jesus' trial? He says, are you the Son of the Blessed? And he says, I am, and you will see the Son of Man coming on or with the clouds, seated at the right hand of power. The first I am, that is, I am the Messiah, that's not, as far as we can tell, illegal. It wasn't, it's not now in rabbinic literature at all, and as far as we can tell, never was illegal. It's the next thing he says, and you will see the Son of Man coming. Tom Wright argues you will see the Son of Man coming with the clouds is not about Jesus's second return to come back to earth to establish new heavens, new earth, but rather it's an allusion to Jesus being vindicated. Him being vindicated. Now, what would be the sign that Jesus was vindicated? Well, his resurrection and ascension. So his resurrection and ascension is the sign that Jesus has been vindicated. And that's Tom's point. Now, New Testament scholars debate that and say, no, he only means the second coming and so forth. But it's a pretty standard view what Tom, as far as I can tell in the scholarship, it's a standard view that Jesus is not talking about necessarily his second return, but rather not a return at all, but rather they will see it in that they will see that when he's resurrected, that'll be the sign. And of course, the destruction of the temple. When the temple was destroyed in AD 70 and he's resurrected, it's a sign that he has in fact been vindicated. Well, Craig doesn't like this view. And you can listen to Craig and get his opinion. I'm not here, and I'm sorry if you want this, or maybe you're past bored already. I know. I'm not here to give all the details of why I disagree. My only point right now I'm making is, what I find myself disagreeing with on Craig more often than not is when he cites from a biblical specialist and critiques them, and in my opinion, doesn't understand, or rather at least has different objectives than the biblical scholar has. Now, I'm not here to defend them. I'm not here to make sure Walton, he's got to be defended, or N.T. Wright, these are big guys. I know that. And I'll repeat it again, just because I disagree with Craig's assessment, it doesn't mean I'm right and he's wrong. I mean, I could be wrong, of course. But based on my training and beliefs and my goals, then he's wrong. Well, David, who gives a rip? Well, maybe you don't at all. But one is, if you do listen to my podcast, understand that I don't come at my approach to Scripture as a systematician, that is, a systematic theologian. And this happens often. Let me say it this way. People. Biblicists don't ask, what do I believe? They ask, what did they believe? That's very important. People who've been trained like I have been, you're trained to ask the question, what did they believe? Systematic theologians tend to ask the question, what do I believe? What do I believe, and what should the church believe today? Those are very different questions. And that has surfaced in my pastoral ministry many, many, many times. And someone says, well, what do you believe about that? A lot of times I have to pause and say, I don't know. I don't know. I've spent so much energy trying to understand what the biblical author believed before I wanted to come to what I believe. But see, that's intentional. I don't want to have a view and then shove it down the proverbial throat of the biblical author. I want to hear their view first and then come to my conclusion. That is very unsettling for a lot of people in my pastoral ministry. And the reason why is for a lot of reasons. One is because they don't want different views. They want a view. For example, it's just well known in scholarship. If you took an intro to Old Testament class, you would learn about what's called a deuteronomistic theology, a deuteronomistic, so Deuteronomy. And it's called that because it's represented in Deuteronomy, but in many other texts, the Chronicles, 1, 2 Chronicles, 1, 2 Kings, 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Samuel, and Judges. So there are several books in the Old Testament that represent a basic theology that goes like this. If you are rich, you own a lot of stuff, have a lot of kids, it's because you're righteous. If you're poor, if your kids died, if you're sick and things are just rotten, it's because you're a sinner. What you need to do to get rich and get prosperous is repent and become righteous. Stop what you're doing. So in general, when a person looks out in the ancient world, if I were to time travel and I were to meet a person who had this view, which again is represented through many ancient texts in the Bible, they would say, absolutely, high five. I'm doing well, man. I got a bunch of new cattle. I'm doing something right. God is showing me favor. I am being blessed. And if I said, man, I'm not, I'm doing everything I know to do, but these crops aren't coming in. I've worked so hard. My wife lost the 4th baby, and we just can't, I don't have a son yet. And they would have looked at me and said, what are you doing wrong? And you got to figure it out. Well, then there comes the book of Job. The book of Job and many other references in the Psalms and so forth, but Job comes out diametrically opposed to that. In fact, it's Job's stupid friends who come along and say, man, whatever you've done, you did repent. And so Job just kind of rubs his hand and beats his head and tries to figure out what he's done wrong to deserve all these bad things. In Job's theology, he's done nothing wrong to deserve those things. Sometimes bad things happen to people when they don't deserve it. Now, it's commonplace amongst Old Testament scholars to suggest that Job was written to have an opposing voice to the deuteronomistic theology represented. Now, if you believe that the Bible has to be all one view with a nice pretty bow on it, you absolutely have to disagree with it. You have to say there's no way that can be true. Nope, cannot happen. You can't have two very different views about how one becomes prosperous or what's the sign of prosperity. You can't do that. But biblicists don't have that view. Biblicists are not trained to make sure there's a bow on it, everything fits together. So it is absolutely standard amongst biblical scholars to say what I just said, and then go to bed at night, and wake up the next day and do it again. There is no emotional trauma or anxiety to say there are two very different views represented in the Bible on that issue. They might say there's two different creation stories in Genesis 1, Genesis 2. Now, there's some degree that's demonstrably true. In some ways, it's probably not true because they're different genres. But there's certainly overlap. But the point here is the biblicist has no problem saying they're two different stories side by side. If you're more of a systematician, it's a big problem. You want it all to fit nicely. If you want one view on divorce, you're not going to have it. There are three major strands of differences of divorce in the New Testament. Some say don't get divorced. Some say Jesus said don't get divorced at all. Some say don't get divorced unless there's unchastity. Some have different issues about divorce. It's okay to get divorced if the person's an unbeliever. That's what Paul says in 1 Corinthians. Well, which one is it? I had a buddy I used to mentor and disciple, and we used to spend hours and hours and hours and hours talking. And one day he came to my office, because he would always ask me about some issue, hell, sovereignty, predestination, whatever. And I would say, well, there's three major views as far as I understand. Blah, 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 A, B, C. And one day he came in and flopped down the chair and said, what about blah, blah? And I go, well, I think there's 2 or 3 views or whatever. And he goes, which one's the right view? He was real mad. Which one's the right one? And I laughed. I said, Ron, I'm sorry to say it, man, but you get to decide what you think is the most compelling. I mean, you have free will. Listen to the arguments and see what you find most convincing. I mean, just you get to. But again, if you're a systematic person, that's really bothersome. And I found that to be true in my pastoral ministry. People say, well, David, what do you believe about that? Well, sometimes what I believe, because of it seems to me, based on the text itself, sometimes I believe that there are 2 or 3 or 4 legitimate, quote-unquote, biblical views on a topic. Now, why would I do that? Because I'm convinced I'm being as faithful to the text as I can be. There are different views in the New Testament of exactly when the powers of evil were defeated. And I could spend a long time on that time. If you listen to my Revelation study, I talk about that. Colossians and Luke and Mark and Matthew and Revelation and Hebrew, they have different times. Some say it happened at his temptation. That's when evil was defeated, when he defeated the trials and temptation in the desert or the wilderness. Others say no, it was on the cross. Some say no, it was resurrection. Some say no, it's going to come when he comes back. Which one is it? Well, people usually say, well, all of them. All of them are true. Evil was defeated all the time. Well, you can have that view. You just can't say that's the biblical view, because the Bible doesn't say that. The Bible doesn't say all of those. The Bible is a collection of books with different authors, and the authors have different views. Where this really, really trips up people is when you have a very particular view of inspiration, which I'm not going to talk about now. I'll do another podcast on that sometime. But if your view is that the Bible is like a book that fell down from heaven, and there has to be a view, and if there is not one view, then it's all corrupt or can't be trusted at all, then these distinctions, these nuances, these differences are very problematic for you. And I saw that. I experienced it first and second hand. Not so much first, I experienced it with other people firsthand, but I didn't feel it much myself, but on this issue. But I knew people in undergraduate and master's degree, particularly undergraduate, that came to classes with very particular views of inspiration and inerrancy, and these things were very problematic for them. Very problematic. It was all or nothing. Bart Ehrman lost his faith when he had this all or nothing mindset. He still seems to have it, all or nothing. It seems to me. But nevertheless, I don't. But there is still an emotional learning curve, you might say, an emotional mental curve of tolerating differing views in the biblical text on a particular issue. Well, can you? Well, that's a good question, I think. Can you? When you go to read the Bible, are you interpreting the texts with an overarching goal of making sure it fits the beliefs you already possess? Are you reading the text with a preconceived notion that it has to fit a different biblical book? We all come to the text, and the encouragement is, maybe the reflection question is, what about you? This is the dominant way to read the Bible. The dominant way is not a biblicist historian, it's not a specialist. The dominant way to read the Bible is to assume that it all has to fit to one absolute perfect nice composite whole. And you can make that work. There are books called Systematic Theologies, and you can read them, and you can study them, and you can decide for yourself whether you find that convincing. People like myself don't find that convincing at all. My PhD was basically in two fields. I started as a New Testament candidate and did almost all the coursework for that. Then I switched over to historical theology. That's another example. Historical theology is like a biblicist is to a biblical theologian. Systematic in that historical theology is different from systematic theology, because historical theologians focus on the development of beliefs about God or church doctrine within a particular time period amongst particular authors. So historical theologians are not attempting to make sure all the views fit together. They're specializing usually in a particular chronological period. Well, that was and I focused on that one, historical theology, for the same reasons why I focused on biblical studies. That is to say, I did not focus on systematic theology, and I could have done a PhD in systematic theology. I didn't personally because I found that very unconvincing. I found myself frustrated over and over and over and over and over when I read systematic theologies say, well, James says this, and Paul says this, and Jesus says this, and so-and-so says this, therefore this is our view. And I could find myself frustrated because they ripped all these verses out of context. They did nuance. And no, that wasn't the point. Oh, no, you misunderstood that. No, that's not whatever. Oh, no, that's not. So in systematic theologies, you could say things that would get you bad grades in biblical studies. Bad grades. And so that doesn't mean they're all right. All I'm saying now, if you ever listen to my podcast, and if you listen this long, but if you're a faithful listener, I'm just kind of showing you my cards of how I read the Bible. I want to read the Bible the best as I can, and I do that with complete failure, I'm sure. But I want to read the best I can, and it's an ancient historical context, literary context, and then decide what the next biblical author thought, believed about XYZ, and then the next biblical author, and the next biblical author, and so forth. And if they don't agree, I don't try to make them fit. I don't try to make them agree. I find that to do that is to be unfair, and it's unfair with the biblical authors, and I think it's not showing integrity with the text. I want to hear what they had to say, even if what they say at the end of the day is a disagreement. If you say, David, that view you just said demonstrates my Bible can't be trusted and is not from God, then I completely disagree with you. I've given my entire life to Christianity and attempting to study and to preach and teach from biblical text. It is the chief authority for belief and practice for every single Christian, even if we come to differing interpretive conclusions. But it does mean for me, when you hear my podcast, if I ever talk about the Bible, I'm doing my best to keep it in his lane. One biblical author, and sometimes just one particular part of the genre itself in its lane, and figure out what it meant right then in that exact moment, and not trying to fit a preconceived notion. But anyway, I encourage you to think about how you read the Bible and why you do, and you can hopefully do a better job than I can. God bless. Well, the conversation isn't finished. You can always reach out to me on social media. Are you on Facebook? I am too. @Glimpse of the Kingdom. Glimpse of the Kingdom on Facebook. Be sure to like it, and you can see updates there. Also, if you're on Twitter, check me out at Dr. D. Pendergrass, Dr. D. Pendergrass, or @Glimpse the King, @Glimpse the King. And I try my best to respond to comments and questions on there as quickly as I can. If you want more, there are many more resources on the podcast and my blog. Go to my website, davidpendergrass.com, and you can see a full list of the podcast, and my blog is available for free. Are you active in a church right now? I'd be happy to come out to your church and do all kinds of classes and workshops there. Check out davidpendergrass.com, davidpendergrass.com for more information. And may God in His great grace give you even just a glimpse of His kingdom this week. See you next time.